Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we are working with an older orchid in my collection, one that seriously needs a repot because the potting mix is going bad. So I thought it would be a good idea to take you along, show you how this medium looks like, and explain why it looks like this. Just have a little bit of a discussion around the subject so we better understand the need in cultivation for repotting orchids, for offering fresh medium and maintaining that medium in good condition. So I hope you'll enjoy today's video. If you do, don't forget to give it a like, you know the drill, and why not subscribe? I post multiple times a week. Right, so let me show you this orchid really fast. By the way, this is, oh no, the tag is fading, I need to rewrite it. It's my Phalaenopsis ludemaniana, which I have to say I kind of forgot about. It was in a corner with multiple other orchids, although it is a summer bloomer, so I need to definitely move it in my worm cabinets. This is a polychilous type of Phalaenopsis, which means it's not triggered into blooming by the drop in temperature. It's actually a continuous worm growing type of an orchid. The medium it's potted in is around 3 years old at this point, and I can see it's amongst the first orchids that I potted in my current mixture because I see it has some leca, which I really don't use anymore. I don't need it. And let's address the elephant in the room. You can see the bark at the top has a lot of white residue. As you might guess, that residue is salt deposit. Now, what I have here on top of my medium is not necessarily going to happen to everybody. For those of you who are using tap water, this might look slightly familiar. The reason why I have these deposits in time is because I do mix my reverse osmosis water with some tap water. I mix it like 30% tap water, 70% reverse osmosis water. And this is because the orchids actually are okay with it, and I am a little bit more economical with my reverse osmosis water. In time though, there will be some calcium deposits on surfaces, including on the top of my medium. If you look inside the pot, you'll see there's not a whole lot of deposits except for maybe the drainage holes or the ventilation holes. If you've ever had a kettle develop these deposits, that's exactly what they are. But these have been forming for the past 3 years. It really takes a lot of time for my water to create these stains because I don't actually use hard water. I use somewhat medium to soft water. If you're wondering if these stains are detrimental to orchids, well, in my experience, no, they're not. Calcium deposits themselves, I don't find to be very hygroscopic, meaning they are not pulling a lot of moisture from the air. Hence, the roots have never had any issues with the salt deposits. Think of these deposits or stains like the ones appearing on clay pots. There are some materials which are either more abrasive, more porous, or just have a lot of surface contact with the air. These are places in which water evaporates very fast, and what's left behind? Deposits. In time, deposit over deposit over deposit, after hundreds of waterings, can actually lead to these stains, which really, if I get a piece and let me see if I can try to remove some of these stains. I can totally remove some, yeah. Something is coming off, but it's not a whole lot. The orchid is more affected by other stuff that I'm gonna get to rather than these deposits. As I was saying, the calcium deposits I don't find to be detrimental. Not even when I used to have semi-hydroponics, I had leca at the top. That had a lot of efflorescence. All the time. It had efflorescence all the time. I didn't have issues. But I do actually have issues with some other salts. Let me just show you really fast the difference between what I have here and something that I do find detrimental. So this is a Phalaenopsis which is currently recovering. It is the one that I used to have in the experiment with the lechuza self-watering pot in which I used pon. If you don't know what I'm talking about but you're curious, I'll link you to that video down below. So as some of you might remember, I removed the orchid from pon because pon really burned the root tips. I didn't like it, and I placed it in my typical sphagnum moss and bark mixture. Everything is okay, it is a recovering orchid, but let me just give you a close-up of some salt residue crystals that I have on the roots. And yes, they are salts, they are not fungi. Do you see those little white filament-like formations right next to those roots? Well, actually, they're right next to some dried bits. The dried bits absorbed some of those salts that the pond had, and since I didn't really rinse all that well my orchid's roots and all of those dried bits, it is actually more obvious now than it used to be since they are dry. If I water the orchid, they will completely disappear, but when the water disappears, those salts precipitate and they form these structures. And I think you can see how different these look like in comparison to the salts that my tap water mixture leaves behind. I do believe, not 100% because I don't have my microscope and I'm not a chemist, but my logic says that these are mainly calcium deposits, while these are something totally different that I really don't know exactly what they could be. Something that the pond had, something from that fertilizer. It is definitely not calcium. I have never seen this forming in my kettle or anything that has lime scale. I think that's the word in English for it. So something like this I do find rather suspicious. The cure for this is to just soak the orchid and then flush it very, very well just to dissolve the salts and then rinse them from the potting mix. By the way, these are not coming from my potting mix. If it never occurred in 3 years with all of my 400 plus orchids, why would it occur with this one, right? So it's something this one came with, which I'm thinking it's something from the pond. Bottom line, the little lime scale that I have here is really not all that detrimental. Do I like it? No. Is it okay to let it accumulate? No, not really, because here's what's not good about it. Every time I water this orchid, a little bit of this can actually dissolve back into the water and leave behind quite the hard water in the structures, which these little orchids don't really like. So I'd rather not have the deposit. Don't imagine all of this dissolves every time I water. Does the lime scale in your kettle dissolve only with water? No, you need to use vinegar, right? I would not use vinegar to dissolve these bits. Pure vinegar is too acidic for the roots. That's just a little bit of an FYI. Besides the point, but I just thought about it. Right, so with all of this blah blah out of the way, let's get this orchid unpotted and talk a little bit more about other bad things that broken down medium can mean for your orchid. So as I was saying, these formations will probably not happen to all of you guys. Depending on the type of water you are using, obviously you're gonna have more or less of these deposits, but also it depends on the orchid, because I don't have these deposits on all of my orchids, but only on those that I really let dry, and actually keep them slightly more on the dry side, because this actually prolongs the life of the potting mix. The wetter the potting mix, the faster it breaks down. When it comes to Phalaenopsis, Cattleyas as well, Vandas as well, and even Dendrobiums, I can afford to let them go very dry in order to extend the time between repottings, because they can handle it. They are very drought tolerant. With Oncidiums and other species which are not drought tolerant, I cannot do this. And as a result, I do need to repot maybe every 2 years rather than 3, but I also don't have deposits because things are rather moist, so they don't have time to deposit. I hope that made sense. But what will happen with organic mixes, no matter the type of water you're using, no matter the orchid you have, is that eventually they will break down. And by this I mean they will start to disintegrate. The bark pieces will not hold their shape anymore. They will become very brittle, which means less aeration for the root system. Especially when it's wet, it can become very soggy and very suffocating. So the integrity of the material will be compromised at some point and the roots might end up suffocated. But that's not all. As they break down, these organic materials, barks, sphagnum moss, coconut husk, and other organic things you might use, they will start to become more and more acidic, and at some point they can become very acidic, so much so that they start to burn the roots. The idea is to repot an orchid before it reaches that stage, and particularly with other types of orchids. Phalaenopsis, the vast majority of them, they have continuous growth. You can actually repot whenever you feel like. I know they say repot in spring, repot in summer, repot, I don't know, whenever the flowers are done, sure. If you don't want to risk the buds and the flowers, just repot in the seasons where your orchid is not in bloom. But for the orchid herself, it really doesn't matter when you repot it, from the point of view of the growth stages. Whereas something like Catasetums or Dendrobium nobilis or Cattleya species, which have a very strict pattern of growth, it is actually important when you repot, especially with Cattleyas that have sensitive roots. With Cattleyas, you typically want to repot as the new roots are already forming, so that the time in between the older roots dying off and the new roots taking over the pot is as less as possible, so that you don't kill your orchid, which I have done in the past with some species. That's what happened to my Mosiae. But what happens when this timing doesn't really coincide with the timing of the medium getting spoiled? It's a problem. If the medium spoils really badly in the middle of summer and you really should not repot that orchid in the middle of summer, what are you gonna do? You're obviously gonna repot and risk really setting back the orchid or even losing it. So it's better to repot before the medium breaks down and starts to damage the roots. As a general rule, organic media should be replaced around every 2 years. You can get away with 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, depending on the quality of the materials. And I don't really use very quality materials here. This is just my local type of fir bark that I find. The sphagnum moss is good though. And how wet the orchid stays. Things like Oncidiums, Phalaenopsis, Masdevallias, they need to be repotted earlier, from 1 year to 2 years, depending on the species, because they stay moist longer. Whereas Phalaenopsis, Cattleyas, some Dendrobiums maybe need to be repotted every 3, 4, 5 years. How do you know when it's time to repot? Well, there are some signs. I think I have a video on it. Check it down below. But to be fully honest with you, it is a bit of a trial and error. It's different when you already have experience with an orchid that needs repotting. You see how the medium smells, how it looks like. You have this visual image in your head, and you will know with your future orchids approximately how much time you need to leave an orchid in its medium. So don't be upset if sometimes you're not gonna get it right. It happens a lot. Just learn from it, because none of us were born knowledgeable. But if you want some hints, do visit that video that I linked to in the description. Right, look at that. Time flies when we blab, doesn't it? Okay, so I'm gonna get rid of this. I'm not gonna reuse this medium, not even the leca. You could reuse leca if you wanted to. I don't need to use leca because I don't need aeration. I need water retention. So I'll be right back with a clean tray. Alrighty, time to remove some of the dead roots, which will happen with older orchids. Structures on an orchid don't live forever. Yes, they can hang on for longer than others. Roots hang on for longer than flowers. But inevitably, in a matter... Oops. We'll get to this, don't worry. I thought I cut a root that I shouldn't have, but it's okay. So after a number of years, even roots can die off, and that is absolutely fine because they will be replaced with a whole bunch of very healthy new ones. So just cut away all of these dead roots when you repot because you don't want them to spoil the new medium faster. The idea is to keep the orchid in the same medium for as long as possible. Alright, so I'm pretty much done with my orchids. There is no need to spray hydrogen peroxide or do anything with these roots because, again, this is an old orchid. I have it for a lot of years at this point. So I know the previous potting mixes it was in. I know if it's infested with snails or not, which is not. I know if it's having some mold outbreaks, which is not. You know, I know the history. No need to use hydrogen peroxide or anything of the sorts. Let's address this. Sometimes Phalaenopsis roots can look dead but actually be alive. Some sections can be dry, but in reality what's dry is the velamen, not the actual root inside. So you can have some roots which have a section that is dry and a section that is alive. Those are still okay, and especially if you see growing root tips, let those be. However, sometimes these dried portions don't survive. If the velamen is compromised, the root inside will have some issues. It's not 100% sure it's gonna survive. And in this case, I hope you can see this portion is rotting. Not only that, the root inside, it's dark and dry as well. So even if this looks fleshy and still alive, it's on its way out. So there's no need to keep it. When I cut it, I second-guessed myself a little bit because I saw this portion, but then I saw this and I was like, what did I cut? Don't tell me I cut a good one, but it's not. If you think you did something wrong, double check. If it's wrong, it's fine. We all do mistakes, but make sure you learn a little bit from every wrong thing you do. So thank goodness this was okay, but I was a little bit scared that I did a boo-boo there. It's not a boo-boo though. Right, so let's get a new pot and new potting mix. Alright, so I went for a similar sized pot, but just a little bit bigger. I want to give this orchid a little bit more room this year. And as I was saying, my typical potting mixture is bark and sphagnum moss, very similar to the other medium that I used for this orchid, minus the leca and perlite. I think I saw some perlite there as well. So one thing that I like to do is to rotate a little bit the orchid to arrange the roots in a manageable way. Then I'm gonna continue to add bark and alternate the layers of sphagnum moss and bark so that I have an airy mixture that is evenly moist because the layers of sphagnum moss are communicating. And on the last layer of sphagnum moss, I like to add my slow release fertilizer. You have details again down below in the description about the products that I use if you just scroll all the way to the bottom. And the last layer is, of course, bark. And my orchid is pretty much done. And this one will go in my rootstock cabinet probably, where I keep all of my summer blooming Phalaenopsis. I think I will make a video on polychylous type of Phalaenopsis because we keep talking about them for a lot of time, but I don't actually have a dedicated video about them to explain to you exactly what they are. I know, Maya. And I did get quite a few comments from my viewers living in very, very hot countries that have issues reblooming normal Phalaenopsis. That video will be for you because guess what? These types of orchids adore constantly warm weather. Righty, so with that said, that is about it. I will reuse the same decorative pot. So that is about it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed hanging out with me today and maybe you learned something new. Stay tuned for that polychylous type of video. If you want to follow me on social media, search for me. I'm at MissOrchidGirl pretty much everywhere. But most importantly, do subscribe to this channel because this is where I post on a very regular basis. So you'll be notified whenever I post something new. So I hope you have a great day and I'll see you next time. Bye.